Here is something Japanese Zen understood about the mind centuries before anyone else was asking. The noise isn't the problem. Something else is. That changes everything about what to do with it. It means the way most people try to deal with a restless mind, including everything you may have already tried, starts in the wrong place. The teachers of the Japanese Zen tradition had a name for the restless mind. They called it shinen, the monkey mind, a mind that won't sit still. That goes back over the same conversation long after it ended. That starts working on tomorrow's problems before today has finished. That brings up the same worry you thought you were done with yesterday. That keeps going long after you've asked it to stop. They gave it a name because they wanted to understand it. They watched their students closely for over 1,000 years. And what they found pointed somewhere unexpected. The leaping had a cause. And that cause had been sitting there the whole time, right underneath all the noise, waiting to be seen. That's what this sitting opens up. How the monkey mind actually works. What the Japanese Zen teachers found sitting beneath all that noise, and why understanding that one thing changes everything about how you live with your own mind. Find somewhere comfortable. You don't need to do anything with your mind right now. If you're listening from somewhere in the world tonight, I'd love to know where you are. Most people who find their way to practice arrive with the same question. How do I stop this? The teachers heard this question for centuries. Student after student, generation after generation. How do I quiet this mind? How do I make it still? The teachers held this question carefully, and they replied with a different one. Why does it keep going? You have been thinking all day. Since before you opened your eyes this morning, the mind was already moving, already planning, already replaying, already in last week or next month. You did not decide to send it there. It went. This is the condition of every untrained mind. You share it with every monk who has ever sat in a hall, every teacher who sat down before them, every person sitting somewhere in this world right now. The movement itself is what the teachers wanted their students to see. The simple fact of it. The monkey mind is always moving. It doesn't leap at random. It returns to the same places. The conversation that ended badly, the decisions still waiting for a certainty that hasn't come, the worry that finds you every few hours, like a familiar ache, the loss that hasn't found a way to settle. The mind goes there the way a tongue finds a sore tooth. Again and again, even when you tell it not to, even when you know it does no good. There is also a quieter movement underneath the leaping. a background scanning, low and constant. Checking. Is everything all right? Has anything shifted? Is something about to go wrong? The leaping toward a clear problem is exhausting in one way. This quieter scanning, the one with no clear object, only the hum of vigilance, is exhausting in another. It never fully stops. The teachers notice that these two movements often feed each other. The mind leaps to a problem. It doesn't resolve it. It returns. Leaps again. The scanning keeps the unresolved worry alive between the leapings. And the loop runs in the background of a whole life. The teachers sat with all of this. They watched it in themselves first. Then in every student who came to them. And what they found, watching with patience, was surprising. The monkey mind is not broken. It's trained. Trained by something. And what trained it goes back much further than this lifetime. Your grandmother had this mind. Her grandmother had it too. Every person who ever sat with a sick child through a long night, every person who heard a sound in the dark and had to decide what it was, every person who carried their family through a hard year, they all had this mind. The monkey mind was doing its job. Scanning, checking, keeping watch. Never fully resting, because resting fully might have meant missing something. The vigilance that exhausts you tonight was once the alertness that kept a family safe. This is where you come from. The restless mind was passed down generation by generation because it worked. It kept people alive. Over thousands of years, the mind learned this. A missed threat is more dangerous than a false alarm. So it scans more than it needs to. Worries about things that may never happen. Replays situations that are long over. This is the cost of a very good survival system running in conditions that no longer require it. The teachers saw this as a condition, like the weather. Something that can be understood. Something that, once understood, begins to loosen its grip. Think of the last time the mind woke you in the night. No emergency was present. The house was quiet. The people you love were safe. But the mind was fully alert, running through scenarios, checking for threats, rehearsing responses to situations that hadn't happened and might never happen. This is the old vigilance, still at work. Still doing what it was trained to do, long after the conditions that required it have passed. The teachers saw this clearly. The trouble they found was this. The monkey mind is still keeping watch through a night that ended a long time ago. Still scanning for dangers that are no longer at the door. The job has outlasted the emergency. We all live in two times at once. The time we are actually in, with its ordinary sounds and ordinary light, and the time the monkey mind is in, which is often quite different. The Zen teachers called this drifting. A monk sits in the meditation hall, body still, hands resting, but the mind is in an argument from 2 weeks ago, or planning next month's journey, or sitting with a worry about someone far away. The body is here. The mind has gone somewhere else. A student who can notice this drift, who can feel the mind moving away, has already taken the first step. A life spent mostly drifting, the teachers observed, becomes a life spent mostly elsewhere. This moment passes while the mind is somewhere else. It passes full. It passes unrepeatable. It passes the way water passes through open hands. The teachers found this to be one of the most difficult things to watch in their students. A meal eaten while the mind was in next week's worry. A walk through autumn leaves while the mind was in a conversation that had already ended. A child speaking while the parent's mind was somewhere the child could not follow. A whole hour with someone who loved them while the mind was replaying something said last month. The moment right in front of them, full and alive, passing unreceived. The teachers gave the restless mind a name. They wanted to be able to point to it. Before the name, students had no distance from the leaping. When the mind ran, they ran with it. When the mind worried, they were the worry. When the mind argued, they were inside the argument. No space between. This is what the teachers called being lost. The mind worrying is experienced as the self worrying. The mind arguing is experienced as the self arguing. There is no distance between the movement and the mover. The river and the swimmer are the same thing. The name opened something small, barely the width of a breath. The monkey mind is moving, and you are noticing it move. These are two different things. The gap matters because it changes what is possible. When you are fully inside the leaping feels like reality itself. The anxiety feels like truth. The worry feels like wisdom. When even a small distance opens, the mind can begin to see itself moving. Even that small distance is enough to begin. The seeing is already something different from the leaping. This is what the teachers meant when they spoke of practice. Practice is the slow widening of this gap. The monkey mind continues to move. What changes is the relationship to the movement. The growing ability to see the leaping as the leaping, rather than simply being the leaping. This takes time. It is not dramatic. The gap opens a little. The mind leaps. You notice. You return. That is all. And done 1,000 times, something gradually shifts. Dogen, the 13th century teacher who founded the Soto school of Japanese Zen, described this as the beginning of practice. To study the self, he said, is to forget the self. The forgetting he meant was this: the moment the self stops being only the lens and becomes the thing seen. When you can see the monkey mind, you are no longer only inside it. There is a quality to this noticing that doesn't move. The monkey mind turns and leaps. The noticing is still. The teachers pointed to this stillness as the most important discovery of the practice. The stillness was already there, underneath the movement, present through all of it. The monkey mind cannot disturb this stillness any more than clouds can disturb the sky. The clouds move. The sky receives them. The sky does not become the clouds. This stillness is already present in the part of you that is following these words right now. Students came to the teachers carrying two kinds of exhaustion. The first was the mind itself, always moving, always returning, never settling into rest. The second was the fighting, the long effort to stop the mind, the failing, the trying again, the growing sense that something was deeply wrong with them for not being able to do what seemed so simple. The teachers pointed to this second exhaustion carefully. Trying to still the monkey mind by forcing it is like trying to calm water by slapping it. You don't calm the water. You make more waves. The direction was inward, toward understanding what drives the leaping. What the teachers saw, sitting with student after student, was a structure. 3 conditions that every untrained mind moves toward, automatically, reliably, the same way every time. The early Buddhist teachers, whose observations Japanese Zen was built on, had already named these 3. 3 forces. 3 routes driving the mind toward the unfinished, the threatening and the uncertain in every mind that has ever turned toward this practice. The teachers found these 3 in every student they sat with. They found them in themselves. They found them in the teachers who had taught them. These 3 had been observed for centuries, named, traced back to their roots. And in every tradition where someone looked carefully at the monkey mind, the same 3 kept appearing. Understanding what drives the leaping changes the relationship to the mind. That change is where the path begins. To see these 3 clearly is to see the monkey mind differently. The leaping becomes a pattern. The pattern has a cause. And a cause that can be seen can, with time, be worked with. You know what it is to lie awake and have the mind drag you somewhere. Not ask. Not invite. Just go. The teachers who built Japanese Zen did not answer this with philosophy. They answered with stories. Stories about monks and masters, about moments of cold and hunger and silence, about the exact places where the untrained mind reveals itself. 3 forces that drive the monkey mind. 3 forces the teachers had been watching for centuries. Here is the first story. Ryokan was a Zen monk who lived alone on a mountain in Japan. He owned almost nothing. A robe, a wooden bowl, some writing brushes. One evening, he came home to find a thief inside, taking the few things he had. The thief saw Ryokan and froze. Ryokan looked at him without anger. Then he removed his own robe and held it out. The thief took it and left. Ryokan sat in his empty hut in the dark and looked at the moon through the open door. Later that night, he wrote in his journal, "Poor thief, he couldn't take the moon." The teachers used this story to point at something precise. The thief moved through the hut, reaching for everything he could carry. He reached for the robe, the bowl, the brushes. He missed the one thing that was actually there the whole time. The teachers called this craving. Not craving in the dramatic sense. Something far more ordinary. The movement of the mind away from what is here, toward what is not yet here. Or what was here and is gone. Or what might be here if things were different. The thief and the monkey mind are doing the same thing. Moving through what is in front of them, carrying away what can be carried, missing what is actually there. You feel this in small ways every day. A good moment arrives. Something genuinely good. And the mind has already moved past it. Already in what comes next. Already in the worry about how long it will last. The good moment passes, and the mind was never fully inside it. Or the long version. After this project is done, after this hard stretch passes, after things settle, then there will be time to rest. Then it will be okay. But the after this keeps moving. The project ends and the mind is already on the next one. The difficult stretch passes and the mind has already found the next difficulty. The moon was always there. The hand was always reaching past it. The Dhammapada, one of the earliest collections of the Buddha's teachings, opens with this: mind is the forerunner of all things. All deeds are led by mind, created by mind. A mind driven by craving creates a life that is always one step ahead of itself, always arriving somewhere else, always leaning into the next moment while this one slips past. The teachers noticed this in the smallest things. A meal eaten while the mind was already in the afternoon. A walk in the evening while the mind was inside a conversation that had already ended. The present moment arriving fully, while the mind was somewhere it had not yet reached, or somewhere it had already left. Like Ryokan in his empty hut. The moon was there the whole time. The reaching was never where the moon was. Here is the second story. A student came to the Japanese master Bankei and said, "I have a terrible temper. It has caused me endless trouble. I don't know how to control it." Bankei said, "Show it to me." The student paused. "I cannot show it right now. I don't have it at this moment." Bankei asked, "Then where does it go when you don't have it? If it were truly yours, you would have it with you all the time. You only produce it when something provokes you. When did you get it from your parents?" The student was silent. The teachers used this story to point at the second force, the one that feels the most urgent and real. They called it aversion. Aversion is the mind's movement against what is. Where craving reaches forward toward what isn't here, aversion pushes back against what already is. They are the same fundamental restlessness in two directions. What Bankei saw in his student was the nature of aversion. It seems permanent, but it only arises when conditions produce it. Between the provocation and the anger, there is a gap. Most people never see the gap. The anger appears, and they are already inside it. The pushing away has already begun. You know aversion in its obvious form. Someone says something that lands wrong. At the time you let it pass. But that night, in bed, the comment is still happening. You have replayed it 20 times. You have found the perfect response, the thing you should have said. The other person doesn't know this conversation is happening. But the mind has been in it for hours. You know it in its quieter form too. The mind that looks back at a day and goes immediately to what went wrong. The good moments were there. The mind passes over them. It finds the edge, the failure, the place where you fell short. And it stays there. The teachers noticed something careful about aversion. It often disguises itself as useful. When aversion is moving, the mind feels engaged, alert, working on something real. The replay feels like problem solving. The harsh self-inventory feels like accountability. But Bankei's question cuts through that. Where does it go when you don't have it? Aversion is a movement, not a fixed quality. It arises. It runs. And with seeing, it can be known before it takes hold. Here is the third story. In 13th century China, a young Japanese monk named Dogen was studying under the Zen master Mushin. He had come from Japan specifically to find a true teacher, and he had found one. During a period of intensive nighttime sitting, a monk beside Dogen fell asleep. Mushin came through the hall and struck the monk's meditation cushion, saying, Zazen is the casting off of body and mind. At those words, something opened in Dogen. He left the hall and went to Ru Jing's quarters. He lit incense and bowed. Ru Jing looked at him. "Why do you burn incense?" Dogen said, "Body and mind have been cast off." Ru Jing leaned forward. "You have cast off body and mind. Body and mind have been cast off." Later, Dogen wrote about what he had understood. Not something added, something removed. The habit, built up over a lifetime, of seeing every situation through the self. He described it, to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be illuminated by all things. The teachers use this to point at the third force. They called it delusion, not hallucination, not confusion. The specific condition of a mind that sees everything through the lens of the self without knowing the lens is there. Delusion runs quietly. Someone you know goes quiet for a few days. No messages, no explanation. The mind begins working immediately. Something you did, something you said, a tone that landed wrong. The mind builds a case. When they finally reach out, they had been sick or simply quiet, and it had nothing to do with you. Notice what happened. The mind made it about the self, automatically, before any evidence. This is the lens Dogen described. Every situation filtered through the same quiet question. What does this mean for me? Is this a threat? Does this reflect well or badly? Are you enough here? Delusion doesn't announce itself. It simply colors what it touches, and the coloring feels like clear sight. What Dogen described as casting off was the moment this lens became visible, not removed in one stroke. Seen. And seeing it is already different from looking through it. Craving, aversion, delusion. The early teachers called these three the poisons. Not a condemnation. A map. Three forces that cloud the mind the way silt clouds water. Every unawakened mind carries all three. Every person listening to these words is moving with all three, right now, in this moment. The Japanese Zen teachers looked underneath the three. They found the ground from which all three grow. And they found a story for that too. A university professor came to visit the Zen teacher, Nanin. He had read widely about Buddhism and wanted to ask about it. Nanin served tea. He filled the professor's cup and kept pouring. The tea overflowed. It ran across the table and onto the floor. The professor watched this, alarmed. It is already full. No more will go in. Nanin stopped. He looked at his visitor. Like this cup, you are full of your own opinions. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup? The teachers called this condition ignorance. Not the ignorance of having read too little. The professor had read a great deal. Something more precise. A mind so full of what it already believes that nothing new can enter. The word the earliest teachers used literally meant not seeing. A mind moving through experience without being able to see the lens it's looking through. Ignorance is the root beneath the three poisons. Craving reaches because ignorance cannot see that this moment is already complete. Aversion pushes because ignorance cannot see that the pushing only adds to what it resists. Delusion runs everything through the self because ignorance has not yet seen that the lens is there. The lamp was always in the room. Practice is learning to turn toward it. But there is one more story, and it may be the most important one of all. For 500 lifetimes, an old man had been reborn as a wild fox. He came each day to the lectures of the master Hyakujo and listened from the back of the hall. No one knew what he was. He looked like an old man, sitting quietly, listening. One day after the lecture, when the other monks had left, the old man came forward. He told Hyakujo his history. In a former life, he had been the head teacher at this very monastery. A student had asked him, "Does a great practitioner fall under the law of cause and effect?" He had answered, "No. A great practitioner is beyond cause and effect." For that single answer, he had been reborn as a fox for 500 lifetimes. He bowed to Hyakujo. "Please give me the word that will free me." "What is the correct answer?" Hyakujo said, "A great practitioner is not blind to cause and effect." At those words, the old man was freed. The teachers used this story to point at karma. Not karma as punishment. Not karma as a ledger of wrongs being repaid. Something more precise. The groove that forms from repeated action. The fox's error was not cruelty or sin. It was one wrong answer about the nature of causes. He had told his students that wisdom placed a person beyond cause and effect. He was wrong. Wisdom does not place you beyond cause and effect. It makes you stop being blind to it. This is what karma means in the Zen tradition. Every time the mind met difficulty and reached for relief, past the difficulty, away from it, toward distraction, the groove of craving deepened. Every time aversion arose and the mind replayed, resisted, returned to the wound, that groove deepened too. Every time delusion colored the world through the self, and the mind accepted that view without examining it, the lens grew more fixed. The groove that brings the mind back to the same wound across different years is karma. The pattern that runs in different relationships, different jobs, different decades, wearing different faces, but somehow always feeling familiar. That is karma. The groove of reaching for the phone the moment the mind goes quiet. The groove of waking before dawn to resume a worry the night refused to finish. These are karma. The monkey mind doesn't choose its tracks. It follows what has been worn in. Think of a path through a field. The first time someone walks it, the grass barely bends. 100 crossings later, the path is clear. After 1,000, it is worn deep. The next person who enters the field doesn't choose the path. They follow where the ground has already been cleared. The groove runs because it has been walked so many times. That is all karma is. The fox's freedom did not come from escaping this. It came from seeing it clearly, not blind to cause and effect. 4 words and 500 lifetimes released. Here is what the teachers were most careful to say. You did not choose the 3 poisons. Craving was not a decision you made. Aversion was not a character flaw you selected. Delusion was not a way of seeing you designed. The grooves were carved before you had the awareness to choose otherwise. Before practice was a concept, before anyone offered a map. Look at the people around you. The person at the next table, the one you passed this morning, the ones who raised you and the ones who didn't know how to. They carry the same 3. The monk in the meditation hall is working with craving, aversion, delusion right now. They have been sitting for years. They are still working with the same 3. The 3 poisons are not a personal failing. They are the terrain of every unawakened mind. What the teachers found, sitting with this, was something unexpected. Not more discipline, compassion. The precise kind, recognizing that what moves through you moves through every other person. The craving that wakes you at midnight, someone across the world is in it too. The aversion replaying the same conversation, pushing against what can't be changed. Someone is held there too. The delusion that makes every quiet stranger a reflection of your own story. It runs in every untrained mind. You are not an exception. You are the rule. And the rule has a remedy. Not a cure arrived at once. A practice arrived at slowly, one moment of seeing at a time. The fox stood in front of Hyakujo and asked the question he had carried for 500 lifetimes. He didn't try to escape karma. He tried to see it clearly. That was enough. When craving arises, we can see it as craving. A movement with a name recognized. The reaching continues, but something in the mind is watching the reaching. That watching is not craving. That watching is already still. When aversion arises, we can ask Bankei's question, where does it go when nothing provokes it? That question is already a step back from the fire. When delusion colors the view, we can notice the lens. That noticing is already what Dogen described, being illuminated by all things rather than filtering all things through the self. The gap is small, barely the width of a breath, but the gap is real. The fox stood in it for a moment, and 500 lifetimes resolved. The mind that wants to see all this clearly is still a mind moved by the three poisons. The awareness that is trying to examine delusion is itself still colored by delusion. The reaching toward understanding is still, at some level, a reaching. Can the clouded instrument see its own cloudiness? The teachers had a simple answer. The fact that you can ask the question is already a kind of seeing. Something in the mind is noticing the fog. That noticing is not the fog. That small distinction, the part of the mind that can see the movement without being the movement, became the center of everything in Japanese Zen. There was a night when this became more than a question. A young monk stood in the snow outside a master's door. He had been standing for hours. Snow falling. Cold he did not move from. He carried one question. A question that could not be answered by the three poisons, or by the stopping of them, or by any technique the mind could produce on its own. What he asked, and what the master said back, changed the direction of Zen. Japanese Zen did not begin in Japan. It was carried to Japan from China by teachers who had learned it from teachers before them, in a line of transmission that leads back to a single conversation. A conversation between two men, one standing in snow, 15 centuries ago. This is that conversation. His name was Huike. He had been searching for years. Not searching in the way the word is used casually. A real search. Traveling, sitting, studying, finding partial answers that led to deeper questions. He had heard that a teacher called Bodhidharma had come from India and was sitting in a cave near Luoyang. Sitting facing a wall. Not teaching in the usual way. Just sitting. Huike went to him. Bodhidharma did not come out to meet him. Huike stood outside the cave. Snow began to fall. He stood as the evening came and went, and the night deepened. The snow rose to his ankles, then his knees. He did not move. In some records of this meeting, Huike cut off his own arm and held it out to show the teacher his sincerity. What is certain is that he stood there until Bodhidharma turned. "What do you want?" Huike bowed in the snow. "My mind is not at peace. Please pacify my mind for me." Bodhidharma said, "Bring me your mind and I will pacify it." Huike searched. He looked for the mind that was troubled. He looked in his thoughts, in his feelings, in his memories, in his fears about the future and his regrets about the past. He looked for the thing that was suffering and could not find it as a fixed thing. He looked up. "I have searched, but I cannot find my mind." Bodhidharma said, "There. I have already pacified your mind for you. Consider what the search must have been like." Not a moment. Huike searched with the seriousness of someone who had stood in snow all night. He looked through his thoughts first, the worries, the rehearsals, the replays. He looked through his feelings. He looked through the memories that came forward uninvited and the fears that had been living in the background for years. Each time the hand reached in, the thing dissolved. He was looking for something with an edge, a shape, a weight that could be carried across a room and handed to a teacher. He found movement, process, nothing that would hold still long enough to be grasped. That exchange became the foundation of Zen. Every Japanese Zen teacher who came after Dogen, Bankei, Ryokan, and every teacher in every lineage was sitting inside the echo of those words. Stay with what happened there. Huike came to Bodhidharma with a genuine problem, not a philosophical question. Real suffering. A mind that would not rest. The same thing that brings most people to practice. Not curiosity about enlightenment, but the simple exhaustion of a mind that will not stop. Bodhidharma did not offer techniques. He did not offer a method for quieting the mind. He gave one instruction: bring me the thing that is suffering. And Huike searched. Honestly, carefully. He looked for the troubled mind as a thing that could be found and handed over. He could not find it. Not because he wasn't looking carefully enough, but because there was nothing fixed there to find. The trouble was real. The suffering was real. But the entity suffering, the solid, permanent, locatable thing called my troubled mind, did not exist the way Huike had assumed. Bodhidharma's response pointed at exactly this. There. Already done. Not because the trouble disappeared. Because the search itself showed Huike what the mind actually was. Not a fixed object that could be grabbed, pacified, controlled, or handed to a teacher. A process, a movement, not a thing. Think of a river. The river is real. The flow is real. The power of it is real. But if you try to grab the river, to hold a piece of it, to find where the river itself begins and ends, water runs through your fingers. The river is not a thing. It is what happens when conditions are present. Remove the watershed, the rainfall, the channel carved over centuries, and the river is gone. Not hidden somewhere. Gone. The river was never a thing. It was always the meeting of conditions. The troubled mind is the same. Real in the way the river is real. Powerful in the way the river is powerful. But not a solid object that can be located, pacified, and handed to a teacher. The teachers drew a direct instruction from this. When the mind is troubled, look for the troubled mind. Not to analyze it. Not to fix it. To find it. Ask, where is this? What is its shape? Does it have an edge? When the hand reaches in, does it find something solid or something that keeps shifting? This is not distraction. It is the same question Bodhidharma asked Huike. And this is the first half of the paradox this story holds. Now a second story. A young monk in training was given a task. He was to carry a bowl filled to the rim with water across the courtyard without spilling a drop. He set out carefully. Eyes on the bowl. Watching every movement of the water. Correcting before each ripple could reach the rim. Holding his breath against the trembling. Slowing his steps, tensing his hands, fighting against any movement that might disturb the surface. He spilled more than half of it. The teacher watched. When the monk arrived, ashamed, with a nearly empty bowl, the teacher said, "You were so focused on the spilling that you caused it." The hands that grip too tightly are never still. The teachers used this story alongside the koan of Huike for the same reason. They point at the same thing from two directions. When you try to quiet the mind by watching the mind, monitoring every thought, correcting every drift, gripping tightly against any disturbance, you become the monk with the bowl. The effort to prevent spilling causes the spilling. The effort to stop the mind from moving causes the very agitation you were trying to prevent. You have felt this. The nights where you decided, tonight, no more. The thoughts will stop. The mind will be quiet. This will be the night it finally works. And those are often the worst nights, because the effort itself becomes noise. The watching of the watching. The awareness of whether you are doing it right. The self-monitoring that never stops monitoring. The teachers called this the second layer of suffering. The first layer is the monkey mind itself. The leaping, the craving, the aversion, the grooves of karma running their patterns. The second layer is the mind that tries to stop the first layer. The aversion toward aversion. The craving for silence. The agitation of trying not to be agitated. Most people who struggle with meditation are caught in this second layer without knowing it. They believe the problem is that the mind keeps moving. The actual problem is the effort to stop it. You see this in grief that won't lift. Sometimes the heaviness is the grief itself. Sometimes it is the grief plus the voice that says, "You should be over this by now." That second voice does not help the first. It adds weight. You see it in anger that won't cool. The anger is there. Then the shame about the anger arrives. The anger about being angry. The effort to not be the kind of person who feels this. Each layer pressing down on the one below. The second layer is the bowl gripped too tightly. The monk's hands were the problem, not the water. Here is the paradox in its full form. The mind cannot stand outside itself. An eye cannot see itself. A hand cannot grab itself. A voice cannot hear itself the way another person hears it. There is a structural limit to what a system can do to itself from within itself. The monkey mind, moving with craving and aversion and delusion, cannot achieve stillness through craving for stillness. It cannot push away its own noise without adding to the noise. It cannot examine itself cleanly because the examination is itself another movement of the same mind doing the examining. You can see this in the meditator who has been sitting for 20 minutes trying to achieve quiet and is tenser than when they started. You can see it in the person who has read every book about anxiety, who understands the nervous system, who knows exactly why they respond the way they do, and is still anxious. Because the understanding has added a new layer of self-monitoring on top. Now there is the anxiety and the watching of the anxiety and the awareness of whether the watching is working. The mind is using its most sophisticated tools to work on the mind. And all of those tools are the same instrument as the problem. This was the teaching that drew Huike to Bodhidharma after years of searching. He had already tried everything the mind could try. More study, more sitting, more effort, stricter practice, and none of it had pacified the mind, because all of it was still the mind working on the mind. The teachers compared this to trying to wash blood off with blood. The instrument being used to clean is the same as the thing making the mess. Bodhidharma's instruction cut through this, not by offering a better technique, by pointing at the assumption underneath all the techniques. The assumption was this: there is a troubled mind, which is a fixed thing, and it needs to be pacified. Bring it to me. Huike searched for the troubled mind as a fixed thing and found he could not locate it. This is the teaching the teachers called anatta, no fixed self. Not the abstract philosophical claim that the self doesn't exist. Something you can only really understand by trying what Huike tried, looking for the troubled mind and finding it can't be pinned down. The suffering is real. This cannot be said clearly enough. The ache at 2 a.m. is real. The weight that doesn't lift is real. The mind that won't stop is real. The teachers were not saying the suffering was an illusion. They were never dismissive of pain. What they were pointing at was something more precise and more useful. The suffering is a process, not an object. And a process can change when its conditions change. An object, if it were truly fixed and solid, could only be pushed away or endured. But the solid, permanent entity called my troubled mind, a thing that exists by itself, with fixed edges, waiting to be pacified, is not what is actually there. What is actually there is a process. Conditions arising, patterns running, causes producing effects, the 3 poisons turning in their grooves. Real, powerful, but not solid, not fixed, not a thing that can be grabbed and handed to anyone. When Huike stopped looking for the fixed thing, not because he gave up, but because his search revealed there was nothing fixed to find, the grip loosened. Not that the patterns stopped. The karma was still there. The grooves of craving and aversion and delusion were still running. But the relationship to them changed. Before, fighting, gripping, trying to pin something down that kept dissolving. After, seeing. The patterns could now be recognized as patterns, movements in the river, rather than as permanent truths about who Huike was. The second layer of suffering, the effort to stop the patterns, the resistance to the resistance, had nothing to grip. The bowl was still, because the hands stopped gripping. Now here is the question the teachers left open at this moment. If the troubled mind cannot be found as a fixed thing, what was doing the looking? Huike searched for his mind. Something was doing that searching. Something looked in the thoughts and found movement, not solidity. Something looked in the feelings and found process, not objects. Something looked and recognized that what it was looking for was not there in the way it had assumed. That something was not the troubled mind. The troubled mind was the thing being searched for. The searching itself required something that was doing the searching. And that something was already still. Not still in the sense of silent or empty. Still in the sense that it was not the leaping, not the reaching, not the pushing away. It was the part of Huike that could look at the troubled mind and find it was not a fixed thing. That part was already outside the grip of what it was looking at. Dogen wrote about this from inside his own experience. Not a philosophical theory. Something he had actually known. To study the self is to forget the self. What he meant was not amnesia or absence. He meant the moment when the self stops being only the lens and becomes the thing being seen. When you can look at the troubled mind rather than only being inside it. The last teaching ended with this. The gap. Barely the width of a breath. The part that notices the fog is not the fog. The koan of Huike is that gap made into a story. The troubled mind is there, looking for itself, finding nothing fixed. And in that moment of not finding, the grip of the second layer loosens. The watching becomes natural. The bowl is carried without the desperate effort that was spilling it. The teachers describe this quality precisely. Craving moves toward. It is always leaning into what is not yet here. Aversion moves against. It is always pushing at what is already here. Delusion filters everything through the self. It is always asking what this means for me. The quality that remained when Huike's grip loosened did none of these things. It did not lean toward, or push against, or filter through. It received. It recognized. It knew what was present without adding to it or subtracting from it. Not emptiness. Not distance. Full presence without the three poison overlay. The teachers named what remained when the grip loosened. They had a word for the quality of awareness that watches without gripping. Not a concept arrived at through philosophy. Not something to be achieved through years of practice, though practice helps reveal it. Something that was already operating when Huike stood in the snow and looked for his mind and found only openness. That quality of awareness, the one doing the looking, not the one being looked for, is where the next part of this teaching lives. Bankei Yoktaku spent years trying to force his own mind into stillness. He sat until his body gave out. He stopped eating. He drove himself through practice after practice, teacher after teacher, and the harder he pushed, the deeper the confusion became. He was not careless or uncommitted. He was completely serious, and the seriousness made it worse. He became seriously ill. The body broke down under the effort. He was close to dying. And at that threshold, when the striving could no longer continue, The machinery of seeking finally ran out of fuel. Something shifted. Not a vision, not a supernatural event. A recognition. What he had been exhausting himself to find was simply present. It had been present through all of the searching, through every failed attempt, underneath every frustration. The mind he was trying to create had never stopped being there. What he had found was not a new state he had constructed through the years of effort. The effort had simply been covering it. The years of striving had been like hands pressed over a spring. The water was always there. The pressure was only making it impossible to reach. When the pressure released, the spring was simply present. He spent the rest of his life in the Soto school of Japanese Zen, teaching this. He sat in large halls without ceremony or doctrine. Farmers came, merchants, soldiers, people who had never entered a formal temple and never expected to. He told them all the same thing. What they were looking for, they had already brought with them. A woman came to one of these gatherings. She had been struggling for years with a mind that would not stop. Thoughts chasing thoughts. Worry following worry. She had tried sitting quietly and found the thoughts still came. She had tried to be more present and found herself narrating the attempt. She stood up in front of everyone and asked, "What is wrong with my mind?" Bankei looked at her. "Right now," he said, "you heard my words and understood them. Before I finished speaking, you already knew what I meant. The thing that received my words, that understood them and felt the recognition and found the courage to stand up and ask, that is the Buddha mind. You brought it here today. You have always had it. It cannot be lost." She waited for more. He said, "What you call your busy mind is something you learned. The Buddha mind is what you were born with. You cannot practice your way into it. It is what does the practicing." This teaching became the center of everything Bankei offered. He called it the unborn Buddha mind. Fusho. The mind that was never manufactured by practice and could never be destroyed by neglect. The mind operating before any of the habits formed. The mind operating now, underneath all of them. He pointed to something everyone recognizes. The threshold just before sleep. Not the restless lying awake with the commentary still running, but the few seconds right at the edge when the mind releases. There is a quality to that moment that is not blank and not busy. The commentary stops not because you stopped it, but because it ran out of material for a moment. What remains at that threshold is not nothing. It is something that the waking commentary has been running over all day. He named this quality of mind Mushin. 2 characters, mu, meaning without or empty, and shin, meaning mind or heart. No mind. the mind before it became an argument with itself. Not the absence of a mind. The presence of mind without the layer of commentary that runs alongside every experience, deciding what each moment means and whether it is acceptable. Consider what that commentary actually does. It narrates. It evaluates. It compares this moment to what was, or to what should be, or to what someone else has. It follows pleasure with the thought of losing it. It follows difficulty with the question of why this is happening. It follows silence with worry about what the silence might mean. Think of someone asked to watch over a house during an emergency. They took the job seriously, walked the perimeter, checked the locks, listened through the night. The emergency passed. No one came back to say the job was done. Decades later, they are still walking the same perimeter, still checking the same locks, still listening for a threat that has long since moved on. The commentary is that watchman, doing its job with complete dedication, long after the conditions that required the job have changed. It was trained into existence by genuine necessity. When the world required constant evaluation, when real threats needed real assessment, when social standing required monitoring, when survival depended on getting things right, the commentary was essential. But it never learned to turn off when the emergency passed. It never received the message that the job was done. The teachers were not saying the commentary was wrong to have existed. They were pointing at something more precise. A watchman who never stops watching cannot tell the difference between a night when vigilance is needed and a night when everything is simply quiet. Every silence feels like a threat. Every moment passes through the evaluation before it can simply arrive. The woman in Bankei's hall was not taught something new. She was shown what was already operating underneath the commentary. The thing that had heard his words and understood them before the busy mind had a chance to evaluate whether they were useful. Now, a second story. In the Japanese art of Kyudo, the student is taught from the beginning that the moment of release is not a decision. In the early years, this makes no sense. The student approaches the target deliberately. Every movement attended to one at a time. The posture is set, the breath controlled, the string drawn while the mind runs its checklist. Angle, breath, tension, timing. The evaluator is fully present, checking each step before approving the next. The arrow is released and the student is already judging before it lands. Too far. Not enough breath. Do it again. The mind is working very hard. The effort is visible in every movement. Years pass. The posture becomes known to the body. The breath settles into its own rhythm. The draw no longer requires deliberation. And one day, without planning it, without deciding, the arrow leaves the bow before the mind catches up. The archer does not remember choosing to release it. It simply went. The archer and the bow and the target have stopped being three things. They are one movement. The masters of Kyudo pointed to this as the true beginning of the practice. Not the years of repetition, though those were necessary. The moment when the evaluator had nothing left to evaluate. When the action knew itself so completely that the supervisor stepped back. And in that stepping back, the shot became clean. The years of practice were not building the capacity for the shot. They were removing what had been standing between the archer and the shot. The archer in that first state, the one checking the checklist, judging before the arrow lands, is working very hard. The archer in the second state is not working less. The body is just as present, just as precisely responsive to everything the shot requires. What is different is the absence of the layer checking whether each thing is being done right. The shot is no longer a sequence of approved steps. It is one unbroken movement. Now a third story. In the halls of Japanese calligraphy, a student may practice a single brushstroke for years. The same stroke every day. The shape, the pressure, the timing of the brush's lift. All of it repeated until the body knows it completely. In the early years of this practice, the stroke is preceded by waiting. The student prepares, settles, and then pauses before the brush touches the paper. Waiting to feel ready. Waiting for the moment to be right. The evaluator checks whether the conditions are correct before giving permission for the stroke to begin. At some point in the practice, the waiting dissolves. The brush arrives at the stroke before the thought does. There is a physical sensation of rightness that comes before the judgment that it was right. The hand knew before the mind approved. The teachers of calligraphy called this the beginning of the real work. Not the end of the years of practice. The moment when those years had finally worn away the obstacle. The stroke was always in the hand. The years of repetition were not building it in. They were clearing the path between the hand and the stroke. The teacher watching a student in that second state would say, "Now the brush is moving." Before, only you were moving. The practice of the tea ceremony was built around the same discovery. The form is precise. Every movement specified. Not to create a performance, but to train the body until the form is so completely known that the mind no longer needs to direct it. When the supervisor has nothing left to supervise, it steps back. And when it steps back, the action is free of the commentary. The tea prepared and received without the self watching itself perform. There is a paradox at the center of all these forms. The practice is deliberate. Years of careful, intentional repetition. And the whole purpose of that intentional work is to make itself unnecessary. to train the evaluator out of the action. The practice is a machine designed for its own dissolution. What the archery hall and the calligraphy hall and the tea room called Mushin was the same thing Bankei had recognized in his years of striving, arrived at from different directions, pointing at the same ground. You have felt a version of this. The familiar drive where you arrived without remembering the turns. The conversation that found its own rhythm, where the words came before you decided on them and the reply was exactly right. The morning where the mind went quiet and the light through the window was simply light. These are not failures of attention. These are the moments the supervisor stepped back, and the mind worked more clearly without it. The teachers found this consistently. In Mushin, the mind is more accurate, not less. More present, not less aware. Because nothing is being filtered through the commentary, what is actually present can be received and responded to directly. Mushin is not the absence of awareness. The archer in Mushin is not blank or passive. Every detail of the shot is fully present to the body and the attention. The weight of the bow, the breath, the feel of the moment. What is absent is the commentary running over each detail. The voice that says, too far, not enough, don't miss. Full attention, clean reception, no supervisor. Now here is the turn the teaching makes. Mushin is not the top of something. It is the bottom. A bell struck rings. The ringing is real, powerful, alive, filling the room. But when the ringing fades, the bell returns to silence. Silence was always the bell's nature. The ringing never changed what the bell was. It was always silent underneath the sound. The monkey mind's noise is the ringing. Real, powerful, filling the whole room of experience. But it is not the nature of the mind itself. It is what the mind does under specific conditions. The conditions of training, habit, accumulated pattern running in grooves worn over years. The silence underneath was never destroyed by the ringing. Bankei called the original nature Fusho, the unborn, not created by practice, not destroyed by neglect, present before any of the habits formed and present through all of them. The archer was always capable of the shot. The calligrapher's hand always knew the stroke. Bankei himself had the Buddha mind through all the years of striving that seemed to be getting him nowhere. The practice did not give them Mushin. It revealed what was always already there. This is why the teachers used the word recognition rather than achievement. You do not achieve Mushin. You recognize it. Achievement requires building what was not there. Recognition requires seeing what is already there and has been overlooked. Recognition works differently from achievement. You cannot try to recognize a familiar face in a crowd. You see it or you don't. The recognition arrives before you decide to have it. Before the evaluator has a chance to approve it. It happens from somewhere underneath the usual decision-making machinery. Mushin recognition works the same way. You cannot decide to recognize it. You can only remove obstacles until the recognition becomes possible. And the obstacles are mostly the effort to achieve it. The difficulty is that what has been overlooked was overlooked for a long time. Long enough to become invisible. Long enough that the commentary started to feel like the original. Long enough that the ringing came to seem like the bell's true voice, rather than a condition sitting over something unchanged. Dogen, the 13th century founder of the Soto school, wrote about this precisely in the Genja Koan. He had left Japan as a young man with a question that troubled him. If the original mind is already complete, already present, why does anyone need to practice at all? He spent years in China before the question resolved itself. He returned to Japan and wrote, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by all things." Dogen is careful here. He does not say, "Stop thinking." He does not say, "Become empty." He says, "Study the self deeply enough that the self loosens its grip." You do not manufacture Mushin. You stop manufacturing the obstruction to it. The study he pointed to is the honest watching, tracing the commentary as it runs, seeing the evaluator's movements clearly, not to punish it or extinguish it, to see it so clearly that it can no longer operate as if invisible. The teachers gave a specific instruction for this. When the commentary is loud, when the evaluating voice is running through its concerns, notice the noticing, not the content of the thought. The fact that something is aware of it happening. Turn the attention back onto the attention itself. This is disorienting at first. It feels like trying to see the eye with the eye. But something happens in the attempt. The commentary briefly has no commentary about itself. There is a small gap, a moment when the watchman looks at himself rather than at the perimeter, and in that moment, the quality doing the looking becomes perceptible. That quality is what Bankei was pointing at in the hall. The thing that heard his words before the busy mind could evaluate them. The thing that the woman had brought with her and hadn't been able to see. The silence that was always at the base of the ringing. This is Dogen's forgetting. The moment when the self stops being only the lens through which everything passes and becomes the thing that is seen. When you can observe the evaluator as the evaluator, rather than living inside it and mistaking its commentary for reality. In that moment, something loosens. What is fully visible cannot operate invisibly. What is known cannot pretend to be the whole of what you are. The enlightenment by all things at the end of Dogen's line is not a dramatic illumination. It is the ordinary moment when what is present can be received as it actually is. When the light through the window is just the light. When the conversation is just the conversation. When the moment is not immediately passed through the evaluation before it has a chance to simply arrive. Consider the last time you were completely absorbed in something. A conversation that pulled you fully forward. A task that needed everything from you. A moment of music or movement or silence that left no room for the commentary. In those moments, you were not managing yourself. The watcher stood down. The mind was doing what a mind does when nothing interrupts it. That is what Mushin feels like from the inside. You have been there. You already know the quality of it. You are not broken. The noise is not evidence of a damaged mind. It is evidence of a mind that learned to scan and evaluate and rehearse, because those patterns were needed and then became fixed. The habits formed around something real. They do not define the mind's nature. They sit over it. And here is what deserves careful attention. The capacity you have right now to notice the noise is itself the evidence that Mushin is present. Something in you recognizes when the commentary is running. Something can step back far enough to see it happening. That small distance, that gap between you and the noise, is Mushin's edge. The bell hearing itself ring. The silence at the base of the sound, briefly perceptible. The recognition is not a step toward Mushin. It is Mushin. What is worth noticing right now, whatever is following these words, the part of you that hears and understands before the commentary catches up, is already quiet. The evaluator may be at the edges, checking whether this is useful, deciding what to make of it, noting the time. But the receiving itself, the thing that understands before any of that starts, is already Mushin. You have not been cut off from it. You have not been able to see it clearly because the commentary runs in front of it so constantly that the original quality never gets the attention the noise does. And this brings the teaching to its next question. If Mushin is original nature, if the silence was always underneath the ringing, what makes the overlay feel so solid and so permanent? The koan of Huike showed why fighting the noise makes it worse. The 3 poisons showed what direction the noise runs. But neither of these answers. Why does the mind come to mistake the overlay for what is actually there? Why does the ringing feel like the bell's own voice? The Japanese Zen teachers had a precise word for this confusion. A word for a specific kind of mistaking. The mistaking of what the mind creates for what is actually present. understanding that confusion is the next movement of this teaching. What makes it worth understanding is not that it is complex. It is that once seen clearly, it loses most of its power. The confusion only works in the dark. Name it, and it begins to thin. In 12th century China, a Zen teacher drew 10 images. Each one showed a man and an ox. The first image is a man running through dense forest. He is alone. The undergrowth is thick. His face shows the expression of someone who has lost something important. He is following tracks. The tracks lead deeper in. He is searching for his ox. The ox has wandered, he believes. It has escaped. He must find it before dark. The tradition that preserved these images noted one thing carefully. The ox never left. It was beside him the entire time. The man was so completely absorbed in the story of the lost ox, so convinced of its reality, so urgent in following its logic, that he could not see the animal standing next to him. The teachers used this image for a specific reason. The ox was not a metaphor for something difficult to find. The ox was a metaphor for what you never actually lost. The searching was the problem. More precisely, the certainty that searching was necessary was the problem. This is what the Japanese Zen teachers called mayoi, a precise word. It means something like being lost inside your own mind, not confusion in general. The specific condition of being so inside a story that you have stopped checking whether the story is true. The man in the forest is not stupid. He is not weak. He is doing exactly what the mind does when it believes something is missing. He is following every available piece of logic to its conclusion. The tracks are real. His urgency is real. His fear of losing the ox is real. The story is just wrong. Now bring this closer. You have a conversation. Something is said, a word, a tone, a silence where something else was expected. It finishes. You move on. But the mind moves back. It replays the exchange. The first time it plays back, it is roughly what happened. The second time, you remember the tone more precisely. A specific word. The pause before the answer. By the third replay, you are certain about intentions. By the fifth, the story has architecture. It has supporting evidence. It has a clear narrative of what the other person was thinking and what it means about you. The story is now more solid than the conversation ever was. The actual exchange has faded. The story has not. In fact, the story feels more real because it is more complete. It has causation, structure, consequence. It knows things the original moment did not include. The mind is not malfunctioning. It is doing what it does. Reconstructing, filling gaps, generating the most coherent account available. The problem is that the reconstruction is now running as if it were the original, and you are living inside it. The teachers gave this a second name for a slightly different version of the same mechanism. Morso. Fantasy that is treated as fact. A look from across a room. Brief. Neutral. Possibly nothing. But the mind does not leave it as nothing. It takes the look and runs it through its library of past experiences, past rejections, past moments when a certain kind of look meant a certain thing. Within seconds, it has produced a conclusion. Something is wrong. They do not like you. Something you did. The conclusion was not based on what happened. It was based on pattern matching from a long time ago. But the mind does not announce this. It does not say, "Here is a projection from unrelated prior experience." It presents the conclusion as a read of the current situation, delivered directly, with authority, as fact, or the future. The thing that has not happened yet, but that the mind builds with extraordinary detail. The conversation that might go badly. The plan that might fail. The outcome constructed in advance, with specific words, specific faces, specific consequences, specific evidence of what it will mean. The mind works hard on this. It covers contingencies. It stress tests scenarios. By the time the actual event arrives, it has already happened inside the story, and happened badly, many times. You have spent hours inside a future that does not exist. And the hours were real. The distress was real. The body held the tension of the imagined disaster as if it were present. This is the architecture of the lost ox. Dogen, the 13th century Soto Zen teacher, described this with care in the Genja Koan. He wrote, "Delusion is seeing the 10,000 things through the self." He meant this mechanically, not as a moral judgment. To see through the self means every experience passes through the story-making apparatus before it arrives. The apparatus is invisible because you are inside it. You do not see the filter. You see only what comes through it. And what comes through has already been shaped, evaluated, compared to the past, assigned a meaning that came from somewhere before this moment. Dogen was specific about this. Mayoi is a condition, not a character flaw. The condition of having a self that processes experience and not knowing that the processing is happening. The man in the forest is not wrong to follow tracks. He is wrong only in believing the tracks lead somewhere the ox actually went. Here is what makes the story feel more real than the present moment. The present moment is just what is happening. It does not explain itself. It has no narrator pointing at the relevant details and indicating their significance. The light through the window is just the light. The sounds from the street are just the sounds. Reality does not come with a coherent structure that tells you what it means. The story does. And the mind has been in the story much longer than it has been in the present. For most people, the ratio is reversed. More hours inside replays and projections than inside what is actually happening. So the story's ground feels firmer, more familiar, more navigable. The story has a narrator, and the narrator is you. Every detail in the story was selected because it matters. Every piece of evidence was gathered because it supports the conclusion. The story has the form of something authoritative. It has cause, effect, consistent characters, and a logical through line from past to future. Reality does not always offer this. Reality is often ambiguous, partial, inconclusive. The story is rarely any of those things. The story knows. And so the mind does something that is almost reasonable. When the story is vivid and internally consistent, and reality is vague and incomplete, the mind defaults to the story. The story is more informative. The story has already done the analysis. This is how you end up living inside something that is not happening. The Zen teachers watched this carefully. They did not conclude from it that the mind is broken. They concluded that a very capable system was operating without awareness of itself. The watchman from the last teaching, still at the perimeter, sending reports about a situation that has not existed for years. The reports are detailed, internally consistent, written with authority. The problem is not the quality of the report. The problem is not knowing it is a report. Shunryu Suzuki, a 20th century Zen teacher, said something that sounds simple until it lands. He said, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few." The expert's mind in this case is the mind that has decided it already knows. Already knows what the look meant. Already knows how the conversation will go. Already knows what this feeling means about you. The beginner's mind is the mind that hasn't yet concluded. That is still actually looking at what is here. Mayoi is the expert's mind at full operation. Now here is the precise point where the teaching turns. Zen does not say, "Stop thinking." That instruction would be useless, and the teachers knew it. Telling the mind to stop producing thoughts is like telling the eye to stop seeing. The mind thinks. That is what it does. Trying to force it to stop is just another story, the story of the person heroically emptying their mind, which is itself a thought, running inside the mind it is trying to empty. What Zen says is something different. And the difference between the two instructions is where everything changes. Zen says, "See that you are thinking." The gap between those two instructions is the entire teaching. When you are inside a thought, the thought is the world. It has no edges. It is not a thought you are having. It is simply how things are. The conclusion feels like an observation. The story feels like a report. You are the man in the forest, fully inside the search, with no awareness that the searching is something you are doing. When you see that you are thinking, something shifts. The thought does not disappear, but it acquires a border. There is suddenly a distinction between the thought and what is actually present. You are now a little bit outside the forest. You can see the trees rather than just running between them. That small shift does not require silence. It does not require emptying the mind. It requires only the recognition, this is a thought I am having. From that recognition, even a brief, unstable one, everything becomes possible that wasn't possible before. Dogen put this directly. He wrote, "Awakening is not a state in which mayoi is absent. Awakening is knowing when you are in mayoi." This deserves a pause. Most teachings on peace suggest an arrival point, a place you reach where the difficulty stops, where the mind settles and stays settled. Dogen does not promise this. He promises something smaller and more honest, the capacity to see where you are, to know when the tracking is running, to recognize the forest rather than only running through it. The teachers were not promising a mind that no longer tells stories. They were describing something much more available. The ability to recognize the difference between the story and the ground. To notice when the tracking has taken over. To see the forest for what it is, rather than following tracks that may have circled back. The man in the first ox herder image is completely lost. His whole attention is on the tracks. The moment he stops, looks up, and thinks, "Wait, he is not yet home." The ox has not yet appeared beside him. But something has changed. He is no longer purely inside the search. There is a small gap between him and the urgency. And in that gap, something other than the story becomes perceptible. That gap is not the destination. That gap is the practice. The teachers called it cognitive freedom, though not in those words. The freedom that comes from seeing a thought as a thought rather than as reality. Modern psychology arrived at this same territory and called it diffusion, stepping back from a thought without fighting it, without arguing with it, without needing to eliminate it. Simply seeing it as what it is. A construction, a product of the mind's pattern matching. Possibly true, not automatically true. The science and the practice arrived at the same point from different directions. You do not need to defeat the story. You need to see the story as a story. The authority it carries dissolves the moment its status as construction is visible. This is not easy at 3 a.m. when the replay is loudest. When the story is most coherent and the mind is most exhausted. When the evidence feels overwhelming and the conclusion feels inevitable. But the instruction is available then, too. This is a thought. This is the mind constructing something. What is actually present right now, before the story, is just this. The breath, the body, the weight of the moment before any conclusion has been reached. The thought will return. The story will resume. The teachers were clear about this. Recognition is not a final resolution. The man in the forest can stop, notice he has been following tracks, and, within minutes, find himself running after tracks again. That is how the mechanism works. What changes with practice is not that the tracking stops. What changes is the speed of recognition. The story runs a little less distance before you notice. The gap comes a little sooner. The authority of the conclusion weakens a little each time it is seen as a conclusion rather than a fact. And over time, gradually, unevenly, without dramatic turning points, the stories that once ran for hours begin to run for minutes. Nothing forces them out. They simply find less purchase. The ground they used to grip has become a little more visible. Dogen wrote, "To study the self is to forget the self." The study of Mayoi is part of this. You look at the mechanism so clearly that the mechanism begins to lose its invisibility. What has been invisible cannot hold its authority once it is seen. The tracking continues. But now you are watching it track. And that watching is the gap the teachers pointed to. There is one more thing worth naming. The stories the mind constructs are often about pain. They replay what hurt. They anticipate what might hurt. They return to the conversation that went wrong, the moment of rejection, the evidence of inadequacy. The mind does not do this out of cruelty. It flags those experiences as requiring more review. Threats need analysis. The mechanism evolved for survival, and pain is the signal that something required attention. The problem is that a system designed to process real dangers in the present does not automatically distinguish between a present threat and a memory of a past one, or a projection of a future one. All three run through the same machinery with the same urgency. So the body holds the past conversation in the same tension it would hold a present threat. The nervous system responds to the imagined disaster with the same activation it would bring to an actual one. The exhaustion is real. The cost is real. The event was not. Consider what this means for a body carrying the story of a future catastrophe. The conversation has not happened. The outcome has not been decided. But the chest is already tight. The sleep is already interrupted. The day is already spent inside a disaster that exists only in the pattern-matching system's output. This is what the teachers meant when they said Mayoi is suffering. The body lives inside the stories the mind generates. When the stories are of threat and loss and failure, the body pays the cost. In proportion to how long the story ran and how real it felt. The gap between the thought and the truth is the only place where this cost can be reduced. The story does not need to be argued down. It needs to be seen as a story, seen clearly enough that its authority becomes optional. What is actually present, right now, is smaller and quieter than anything the story contains. And that smaller, quieter thing is where the body can actually rest. The question the teaching leaves open is how. When the story is loudest, when the tracking is fastest, when the gap feels inaccessible, how do you find it? The Zen answer is a practice. Simple enough to sound insufficient, deep enough that teachers spent entire lifetimes in it. Just sitting. A practice so stripped down it has no method to follow, no goal to measure, no technique for handling the thoughts when they come. The mind arrives as it is. The tracking runs. And the practice is simply to stay, not as a demonstration of patience, but as the most direct way of seeing the tracking for what it is. What it teaches has no equivalent in any other instruction. In the winter of 1225, a young Japanese monk named Dogen was sitting in a meditation hall in China. He had come here after years of searching in Japan for a teacher who could answer the question that had driven him since childhood. If the original mind is already complete, if nothing is missing, if the ground of awareness has always been present, why does anyone need to practice at all? The hall was cold. The session had been long. Somewhere in the rows, a monk had dozed. His teacher, Rujing, moved through the hall. When he reached the sleeping monk, he said, not gently, "In Zazen, you must drop body and mind." It was not directed at Dogen, but something in Dogen dissolved. Not in response to the words, in the silence after them. When the session ended, he went to Ru Jing's room. He knocked. Ru Jing opened the door. Dogen said, "Body and mind have dropped away." Ru Jing studied him for a moment. Then he said, "Body and mind have dropped away. You have dropped body and mind." He rang his bell. He turned back to his cushion. The conversation was over. Dogen carried this back to Japan and spent the rest of his life trying to say what had happened in that room and what had happened in the silence before it. What he kept returning to was this: the Zazen had not produced the experience. The Zazen was the experience. The distinction he had always assumed between the practice and the realization, between the training and the arrival, had simply collapsed. When he looked closely at what had happened, he could not say that the sitting had led to the dropping. The sitting and the dropping had been the same event. He went home and wrote down how to sit. He called it Fukan Zazengi, a universal guide. And the instructions were strange, because most instructions for practice describe what to do in order to get somewhere. These instructions described what to do when there is nowhere to go. He wrote, "Do not think about good or bad. Do not try to achieve anything. There is nothing to gain, nothing to certify." The posture he described is not about performance. Spine naturally upright, the kind of straightness that comes from finding balance, not from forcing the back into a shape. Chin slightly in, as if the back of the head is being gently lifted. Eyes resting downward at roughly a 45-degree angle. Soft focus, not staring, not closed. Hands resting in the lap, right hand beneath left, thumbs touching so lightly that a piece of paper could rest between them. The body is not in a posture of effort. It is in a posture of readiness, alert without straining, still without being rigid. Like a person sitting at a table before the conversation has begun, present, open, not yet doing anything. The breath is left alone. This is harder than it sounds. The mind that wants to practice immediately wants to do something with the breath. Slow it, deepen it, count it, measure whether it is correct. Dogen's instruction cuts through all of that. The breath knows how to breathe. The body has been breathing since before there was any intention to breathe well. The instruction is simply to observe, to let the breath be exactly what it is right now, shallow, irregular, tentative, or long and slow. Whatever it is fine. The observation is the practice. The control is the interference. And the thoughts come. This is the point where most people decide they are bad at this. They sit for 30 seconds and the mind produces a grocery list, a half-remembered conversation, a sudden awareness of a physical discomfort, an evaluation of how the sitting is going. They conclude that something has gone wrong, that they are not the kind of person who can do this, that the mind they have is too busy for this particular practice. This conclusion is the first thing Zazen teaches you to notice. The thoughts coming are not the problem. They are the practice. Dogen's instruction for thoughts during Zazen is the same instruction he gave for everything else. Notice and return. Return to here, to the fact of sitting, to the body on the cushion, the hands in the lap, the weight of the moment. The noticing and returning is not failure. The noticing and returning is the entire practice. What the teachers meant by this goes deeper than it first appears. When a thought comes and you follow it, rehearsing a conversation, planning the afternoon, replaying last night, the mind has left the present and entered the stories described earlier in this sitting. The tracking has engaged. You are in the forest, following tracks. The moment you notice you are following a thought is the moment the teacher pointed to. That exact moment of recognition without judgment, of seeing without condemning, is the thing Zazen trains. Each time you notice and return, you are not correcting a mistake. You are practicing the most important movement available to a human mind, coming back to where you actually are. Do this 10 times in one sitting. You have practiced 10 times. Do this 200 times. You have practiced 200 times. The number of thoughts is not the measure of failure. The consistency of returning is the measure of practice. Now here is what Dogen taught that no one before him had stated so precisely. He called this practice shikantaza, just sitting, and his teaching about it contradicted every assumption a beginning practitioner brings to the cushion. Most people sit in order to get something: calm, clarity, relief from the noise, a moment's break from the tracking. These are understandable reasons, and they are not wrong. But Dogen saw that even these gentle motivations carry a distortion. They position the sitting as a means and the calm as the end. They assume that the value of the practice lies in what it produces, that the sitting is worth something because of what comes after. His teaching reversed this completely. The sitting is not the road. The sitting is what it looks like to have already arrived. When you sit with nothing to gain and nowhere to go, the mind is expressing its original nature, the nature Bankei pointed to, the Mushin the archery hall was uncovering through years of practice. The sitting does not produce that nature. The sitting allows the nature to appear by removing the constant pressure of purpose. There is a common objection here. It sounds like a paradox. If sitting already is the expression of original nature, why does it feel so unfamiliar? Why does the mind resist it? Why does the body ache and the thoughts churn and the first 5 minutes feel like forcing something that should be natural? The answer is in what the sitting reveals. The original nature has been covered, consistently, reliably, for most of waking life, by the commentary described in the last teaching. The constant evaluation, the tracking, the stories running, the watchman checking the perimeter. The covering is so continuous that when it briefly stops, the mind does not recognize the underlying quiet as rest. It recognizes it as absence, something missing, something that should be filled. And so the commentary reasserts itself, and the sitting feels like failure, and the ache in the knees becomes an argument for stopping. This is not a signal that the practice is going wrong. This is the practice going exactly right. The discomfort is the commentary encountering something it cannot manage. The commentary can plan, evaluate, replay, narrate. It cannot find a foothold in a moment that is genuinely asking nothing of it. The unfamiliarity of that position is what the fidgeting and the restlessness actually are. The commentary reaching for its usual tools and finding nothing that requires them. The instruction is simply to stay. Dogen wrote in the Fukan Zazengi that the barrier is not the mind's difficulty. The barrier is the assumption that there is something to break through. It is not a question of sitting or lying down. Do not seek enlightenment. Do not flee ignorance. Just sit. In another text, the Bendower, he wrote something that at first sounds like encouragement and reveals itself as something more fundamental. He wrote, "Zazen of one person, even for a single moment, is in unity with all existence and permeates all of time." This is not encouragement to keep going. This is a statement of what Zazen already is. He means it precisely. When a mind sits in genuine stillness, simply ceasing the constant pressure of purpose, setting down the agenda entirely, something changes in the texture of that moment. The moment becomes permeable. The ordinary separation between the one sitting and the space in which the sitting happens softens. What is usually background, the quality of the light, the temperature, the sounds, the specific weight of this particular second, arrives at the attention without being selected. Reality arrives as itself. This is what Dogen meant by being enlightened by all things. The simple fact of the moment being allowed to be exactly what it is, without immediately passing through the apparatus of evaluation and narration. Even for a moment. Even an imperfect, distracted, thought-filled moment. Now here is what the practice does over time. The change is not dramatic. It does not arrive as a breakthrough or a sudden clearing. In the first days of sitting, very little changes. The mind continues to produce its usual volume of content. The tracking runs. the stories resume the moment the sitting ends. Someone who has been sitting for 2 weeks looks very much like someone who has been sitting for 2 days. What is changing is subtle and in the wrong direction to measure. What changes is not the thoughts. It is the relationship to the thoughts. A gap appears. Small at first, almost imperceptible. The gap between a thought arising and the automatic commentary about the thought. Between an emotion arriving and the story about what the emotion means. Between an impulse and the action it usually produces before any awareness has been involved. That gap was always there. The attention had never learnt to notice it. The years of sitting train the attention, slowly, incompletely, with many reversals, to find the gap and rest there, even briefly, before the commentary engages. In that gap, something becomes available that is not available inside the commentary. A choice. A response that is genuinely responding to what is present, rather than to the story about what is present. A quality of attention that is not managing the experience from above, but receiving it from inside. This is what the student in the Huike story was glimpsing. In the moment after Bodhidharma asked him to bring his mind, the moment he realized there was no solid thing to bring, the commentary briefly had nothing to say. The searching stopped. The gap opened. And in that silence, something became perceptible that the searching had been covering. Zazen is the formal structure around that gap. It trains you to find the conditions under which the gap becomes accessible, and then to stay there long enough for the staying itself to become familiar. Dogen understood that this familiarity was not the goal. The familiarity with the gap is what makes the goal irrelevant. Once the gap is familiar, once the mind knows the quality of the moment before the commentary engages, the question of whether you have achieved anything dissolves. The achieved and the not yet achieved are categories inside the commentary. In the gap, they do not apply. He corrected a misunderstanding that had been circulating even in his time. Some teachers taught Zazen as a technique, a way of inducing states, producing experiences, generating the conditions in which something would be revealed. This framing made the practice into an instrument. You used the sitting to make something happen. Dogen said this had the relationship backwards. The sitting is not used. The sitting is the thing itself. What you are trying to arrive at through practice is already fully present in a moment of genuine, purposeless sitting. In this moment, if the moment is approached as it is rather than as a vehicle for something else. This is why he named the practice shikantaza, just sitting. The just does enormous work in that phrase. It means without agenda, without accumulation, without the subtle pressure of trying to do it well. The sitting that is measuring its own quality is not shikantaza. The sitting that is measuring nothing, going nowhere, requiring nothing of itself, simply being exactly what a body and a mind look like when they have set down every project. That is shikantaza. This does not mean the mind will be still. It means only this: whatever is happening is allowed to be what it is. The busy mind is allowed to be busy. The restless body is allowed to be restless. The doubting mind is allowed to doubt. None of it is evidence that the sitting is failing. The sitting cannot fail because it is not trying to produce anything. Dogen was very clear about one thing that often gets mistaken. He was not the first person to bring meditation to Japan. That had been done before him. The monk Eisai had brought the Rinzai school of Zen to Japan in the late 12th century, 70 years before Dogen was born. What Dogen brought back from China was something more specific: the particular approach of the Soto school, with its emphasis on Zazen as complete practice rather than as a method pointing elsewhere. The difference matters because it shapes how the sitting is held. Rinzai Zen used what are called koans, sharp, impossible questions that a student carries into sitting and presses against until something gives. The tension is deliberately maintained. The question drives the practice. The sitting is in service of the inquiry. Soto Zen, as Dogen taught it, releases the inquiry. There is no question to carry in, no answer being sought. The sitting is not in service of anything. The sitting is its own complete expression. Both approaches are genuine. Both have produced generations of practitioners who describe the same territory reached from different roads. Dogen's road is the one that asks the least, and in asking the least, asks the most. Because sitting with no agenda, with nothing to achieve, with no measure of success available, is harder than sitting in pursuit of something. The mind that has no goal to strive toward has nothing to hide behind. It cannot report back on progress. It can only be what it is. And being what it is without commentary turns out to be the most demanding practice of all. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Every other form of practice offers a measure. You meditated for 10 minutes and you felt something. You sat for a week and something shifted. You have been sitting for years and the sessions are different now. These measures are not harmful. They are the natural response of a mind that understands everything through comparison and progress. Dogen gently removes them. The gap does widen over time. The recognition does come faster. The tracking does run shorter distances before you notice. These things happen. But if the sitting is held as a way of producing them, then the sitting has reintroduced the very mechanism it was designed to make transparent. The evaluator is back at the perimeter, checking results, approving or disapproving the session. The instruction is only to sit. The progress takes care of itself. Now, practically, if you were to sit today, even for 5 minutes, the instructions Dogen left are enough. Find a position where the spine can be upright without effort. Chair, floor, cushion, the surface matters less than the alignment. Let the hands rest in the lap, thumbs barely touching. Let the eyes settle downward, soft, not focused on anything in particular. Let the breath arrive. Observe it the way you might watch rain on a window, interested, not controlling. When a thought comes, which it will, within seconds, probably, notice it. This is a thought. Then return to the body, to the breath, to here. When the thought comes again, which it will, immediately notice it again. Return again. That is the practice. In its entirety, nothing is withheld. Nothing more complex is concealed behind the simplicity. This is what the teachers were doing. This is what was transmitted from teacher to student across 8 centuries of this school. It will feel insufficient at first. The mind that has been running complex operations all day will find this too sparse, too undirected, too empty. That feeling of insufficiency is not a problem to solve. It is the first piece of information the practice offers. The mind that feels the sitting is insufficient has never actually sat. It has evaluated the sitting. It has decided the sitting should be different. It has narrated the sitting's shortcomings. But it has not sat. The sitting itself, the actual present moment experience of a body at rest and a breath moving, is already complete. Dogen said it directly. You are already a Buddha. The sitting is how you stop arguing with that fact. What changes in the practitioner over months and years of this is not a quality of mind that was previously absent. It is a quality of attention, the ability to find the gap earlier, to rest there longer, to return more easily when the commentary reasserts itself. The sitting does not change the mind's nature. It changes the mind's relationship to its own activity. And that shift from inside the noise to watching the noise is not a destination. It is a direction. A direction that becomes a little more familiar each time you sit down with nothing to prove and nothing to gain and simply stay. After enough time sitting like this, something begins to transfer off the cushion. The gap that appears in the silence of a 10-minute sitting starts to appear in the middle of a difficult conversation. The return that was practiced hundreds of times in still air begins to happen in the noise of the ordinary day. A moment arrives where you notice the tracking running in real time, and the noticing itself creates the pause. The teachers described the relationship between the sitting and the rest of life as water and stone. Patient, unremarkable, arriving without force, and finding, over time, a path through what seemed immovable. There is a stone at the base of every waterfall. The water arrives and the stone does not move. The stone is harder. The stone is heavier. By every measure of force, the stone should win. But water does not contest the stone. It arrives, finds where the stone ends, and continues there. Around the sides, over the surface, under the base if there is space. The water is not patient. Patience requires effort. The water is simply water. It does what water does. It finds the available path and takes it. A year passes. The stone looks the same. 10 years pass. The stone has changed. 100 years. The stone is unrecognizable. Smooth where it was rough. Hollow where it was solid. Shaped entirely by what arrived without force. Laozi, the ancient Chinese sage whose writing became the root text of Taoism, returned to this image again and again. In the 78th chapter of the Tao Te Ching, he wrote, "Nothing in the world is softer than water. Yet for overcoming the hard and the rigid, nothing surpasses it." He was not writing about rivers. He was writing about how a mind meets what it cannot immediately overcome. When Zen Buddhism came to China from India, it encountered a culture that had been thinking about this for centuries. Taoist ideas about following the natural course of things, about yielding as a form of strength, about the way water moves, were woven directly into what became Chan Buddhism and later Zen in Japan. This was not accidental borrowing. It was recognition. Two traditions arriving at the same principle from different starting points. The principle is this: resistance has a cost. And most of the time, it is the one who resists who pays it. Bring this to the mind, and the principle becomes precise. A thought arrives. An unwanted one, a fear, a worry, a memory you have already been through 50 times. The mind's immediate response is to resist, to push back, to argue with the thought, suppress it, negotiate with it, explain why it should not be here. The mind mobilizes against its own content. It treats the thought as an intruder and itself as the security force. Watch what happens when it does this. The thought does not leave. It gets heavier. The effort required to suppress it becomes the very thing that keeps it present. The more attention the resistance requires, the more central the thought becomes. It is no longer one thought among many. It is the thought around which everything else is organizing itself. The resistance fed it. A Chan teacher in China was once asked by a student how to be free of a thought that had been returning every morning for months. The teacher said, "You have been paying this thought a visit every morning for months. Why are you surprised it keeps showing up? Every time you fought it, you told it where you lived." The Zen teachers recognized this mechanism clearly. They called it precisely not the thought as the problem, but the relationship with the thought. The stone is not the obstacle. The attempt to move the stone by force is the obstacle. What water shows is a third option beyond fighting and giving in. Water does not surrender to the stone. It reaches its destination. It shapes the landscape over time. It is effective in a way that direct force rarely is. But it achieves this by never opposing the stone directly. It simply remains water and continues arriving. The Japanese Zen tradition gave this principle a name, Mushin, a word that means without obstruction. The condition of a mind that moves through experience without jamming against it, without the constant friction of rejecting what is here in favor of what should be here. In ordinary experience, the mind spends enormous energy on this friction. Every unwanted thought is greeted with resistance. Every uncomfortable feeling is assessed for whether it is acceptable. Every moment that does not match the expectation generates a small act of rejection. The mind is not just experiencing what is here, it is constantly negotiating with it. The fatigue this creates is real. A day spent resisting what the mind produces is more exhausting than a day spent simply receiving it. The river that fights every stone does not reach the sea faster. It loses itself in the fighting. Now here is where the teaching becomes specific. Muj does not mean accepting everything the mind produces as true. It does not mean surrendering to the worry, agreeing with the fear, believing the replay. The water does not become the stone. It remains water. What changes is the relationship to the obstacle, not the water's nature. Applied to thought, the practice of muge is seeing the thought without being captured by it, receiving it without building a response to it, allowing it to be present without treating its presence as a crisis, requiring intervention. The thought arrives. The water notices the stone. The water does not push. This is the quality Zazen trains. Each time a thought appears in sitting and is met with, "This is a thought," rather than with argument or suppression, that is water finding the path around the stone. The thought is not being defeated. Its authority over the next action is being quietly redirected. The Zen teachers who absorbed Taoist thinking were pointing at something that modern psychology would not confirm until the 20th century. In acceptance and commitment therapy, one of the most extensively tested approaches to anxiety and intrusive thought, researchers discovered the same principle from a different direction. They called it cognitive diffusion, the practice of changing the relationship to a thought rather than the content of the thought. The standard instruction for cognitive diffusion sounds almost trivially simple. When a painful or unwanted thought appears, instead of treating it as a fact to be accepted or refuted, you place a small phrase in front of it. I am having the thought that. I am having the thought that this will go badly. I am having the thought that something is wrong with me. I am having the thought that this will not improve. The content of the thought does not change. The relationship to the thought changes completely. What was a statement of fact becomes a product of a mind doing what minds do. The distance between the observer and the thought is made explicit. The stone is still there. The water has found the way around it. Researchers found this more effective than disputing the thought. Arguing with "this will go badly," producing counter-evidence, reminding yourself of past successes, reasoning against the catastrophe, engages the thought at the level of content. It treats the thought as worth arguing with. And a thought treated as worth arguing with becomes a worthy opponent. The argument grows. The stone becomes the whole river. The Zen teachers arrived at this without the clinical framework and without the research apparatus. They arrived at it through sitting, through years of watching the mind produce its content and observing what happened when the content was met with force versus what happened when it was met with water. What they observed was consistent. The fighting never resolved the thought. The receiving, not agreeing, not surrendering, simply receiving, allowed the thought to pass at its own speed, which turned out to be much faster than the speed at which it passed when held in place by resistance. The second Taoist principle that moved into Zen is related but distinct. Following conditions, responding to what is actually present rather than to what should be present. Meeting the current moment as it is, rather than as you wish it were. A mind following conditions does not wait for better circumstances to be at peace. It meets what is here, difficult, uncomfortable, unclear, with the same quality of attention it would bring to a quiet morning. The quality of attention does not depend on the quality of what it attends to. This is not passivity. The river following its conditions is the most active thing in the landscape. It is constantly moving, constantly responsive, constantly finding the path that is actually there. What it is not doing is spending its energy on the path that should be there. A mind responding from stillness, from the gap opened in the last teaching, acts more precisely than a mind reacting from panic. The reaction from panic is the stone-fighting response. Large, forceful, expensive, and usually missing the target. The response from stillness is the water response, finding what is actually available in the current situation and moving there. The teachers were careful to distinguish this from resignation. Laozi wrote, "Water benefits all things and does not compete." The key word is benefits. Water gets things done. The canyon wall is evidence. The smooth stone at the base of the falls is evidence. The river reaching the sea is evidence. What water does not do is deplete itself in the attempt. It arrives, works through what is available, and continues. This is what the practice is training toward. A mind that can move through difficulty without the constant overhead of fighting difficulty. A mind that can receive what is present, including what is painful and unwanted, without the secondary layer of resistance to the reception. The pain is the stone. The resistance to the pain is the attempt to move the stone by force. The stone stays. The effort compounds. Water around the stone reaches open water. There is one misunderstanding of this teaching that the Zen teachers kept returning to because students kept arriving at it. The misunderstanding is this: if you do not resist your thoughts, won't they take over? If you stop fighting the worry, won't it become everything? If water yields to the stone, doesn't the stone win? The answer requires slowing down. Water does not yield to the stone. Water remains water in the presence of the stone. Its nature does not change. Its direction does not permanently change. It flows around, and beyond the stone, it continues in the direction it was always going. The stone does not redirect the river. The stone is a local condition. The river is the whole movement. Applied to the mind, the thought that is met with non-resistance does not take over. It passes. At its natural speed, which is faster than the speed at which it passes when held in place by fighting. The awareness that received it continues. The water arriving still. This is why the long practice of sitting, described in the last teaching, gradually shifts something that is difficult to describe directly. The practitioner does not become someone who no longer has difficult thoughts. They become someone for whom the difficult thought is a stone in a river, rather than a stone on a road. The stone is the same. The medium in which it is encountered has changed. The teachers also pointed to one practical consequence of this shift that surprised students. When the resistance drops, so does the volume. The thought that required constant management had that volume, partly because the management was feeding it. Remove the attention given to fighting, and the thought loses a significant portion of its presence immediately. What remains is the original thought at its actual size, without the amplification that resistance added. And the original thought, at its actual size, is often far smaller than the battle around it suggested. Water wears the stone by arriving consistently, by never stopping being water. The quality being pointed to in all of this has a simple description that makes it sound easier than it is. Being here. Fully here, without the portion of attention devoted to wishing things were different. without the overhead of managing the experience rather than receiving it. Available to what is actually present rather than to the version of it your mind has constructed. Dogen found this quality in the ordinary, the teaching that most surprised his students, and the one that keeps surprising each generation of practitioners who encounters it, is that this quality is not located in the special. It is not found in elevated states of practice, or the most profound sitting, or the most carefully constructed conditions. It is found in the bowl of rice, the cup of water, the simple completing of what is in front of you with full attention and nothing held back. There is a question in Zen that reaches this center faster than any explanation. It is 4 lines of exchange between a master and a student. It involves a bowl, and it contains what might be the most direct statement of where this entire practice is pointing. Have you eaten your porridge? The monk had just arrived. He had traveled a long distance to reach this monastery. He had come with the question that every sincere practitioner eventually carries. Where does the practice begin? What is the starting point? What must be done, and how? The master's name was Zhao. He had been teaching Chan Buddhism for more than 60 years at the time of this exchange. He was already in his 80s. He would live, according to the records, to be 120 years old. He is one of the most quoted teachers in the entire history of Zen. His words were collected in the Jiaozhou Chanshi Yulu, the record of sayings of Zen master Zhao, a text that practitioners have turned to for over 1,000 years. And when the monk asked for instruction, Zhao said, "Have you eaten your porridge?" The monk said yes. Zhao said, "Wash your bowl." And the monk awakened. Consider what the monk might have expected to hear. He had made the journey to ask one of the most revered teachers of his era for guidance. He might have expected a discourse on emptiness, a prescription for years of rigorous sitting, instructions for specific practices to be undertaken in sequence, at precise hours, with careful attention to their proper form. He expected to receive something commensurate with the seriousness of what he was seeking. What he received was a direction toward his own kitchen. The question, "Have you eaten?" is a question about what is already real. It is not abstract. It is not elevated. It is a question about the morning, the body, the bowl in the monk's recent hands. Zhao began exactly there, in what had already happened, and from there the answer came, go to that. Go to the bowl. Go to the warm water. The teaching lives there. For a moment, the monk might have stood very still. The question that had organized his entire journey, all that distance, all that seeking, had been answered with the most ordinary instruction imaginable. There was nowhere left to go. The bowl was already there. His hands were already capable of the task. The whole thing had been present from the beginning. The exchange has been sitting in the center of Zen teaching for 1200 years. Students have been turning it over ever since. What is it saying? What was Zhao Zhou pointing at with 3 words? The first reading people arrive at is usually this: pay attention while you wash your bowl. Be mindful. Bring awareness to the small things. Zen is ordinary life lived with care. That reading is true as far as it goes. But something more central is being missed. It still treats Zen as a quality you bring to washing the bowl, an attention you layer over an ordinary action from the outside. The bowl is still just a bowl. Awareness is still something separate from it, something you carry in and apply. The bowl and the practice are still 2 things. What Zhao Zhou was pointing at collapses that twanis entirely. There is no separation between the washing and the practice. The bowl, the water, the hands, the motion, this is the practice. This is the realization. The monk arrived, looking for something beyond the bowl. Zhao Zhou was showing him that the thing being looked for is the bowl itself. The monk was right to seek. The seeking brought him to the gate. But at the gate, the seeking had done its work. What remained was simpler than any instruction. A bowl. Warm water. The next available moment. Dogen came to the same understanding through a different door. He gave it a name, Shusho Ito. Practice and realization are one. The 2 characters, one for practice, one for realization, do not describe 2 stages of a journey where one leads to the other. They describe a single event seen from 2 angles. The washing is the realization. The sitting, as the last teaching showed, is not the road toward awakening. It is awakening expressed. Most people understand their day as divided. There is practice, and there is the rest of life. The sitting happens at a certain hour. Then the sitting ends, and ordinary life resumes. The cooking, the commute, the conversation at the end of a tired day, these feel like intervals between the real work. Shusho Ito says, the interval is the practice. The cooking is the practice. The listening at the end of a tired day is the practice. The bowl you are about to wash is the practice. Think of what this means in the texture of an ordinary day. The moment you make tea, fully present in the pouring, that is it. The moment you listen to someone without mentally composing your reply, that is it. The moment you feel the weight of a tool in your hand and give your full attention to the work directly in front of you, that is it. Each moment, complete in itself. Each one already whole. The mind that hears this often responds with a kind of surprised stillness, as if something it had been carrying very carefully could be set down. The project of getting to the place where practice is possible has been, it turns out, the very thing preventing the recognition that practice is happening right now. There is a kind of relief that comes with this, quiet and unexpected. The exhausted listener does not need to find one more hour in an already full day. The practice that seemed to require special conditions turns out to require only the conditions already present. The floor, the breath, the bowl at the end of a meal. This is not a lowering of standards. This is the end of the false barrier between living and arriving. This is the same principle the teaching about water and stone arrived at from the other direction. The practice does not produce the result. The practice is the result. The water arriving at the stone is not preparation for the shaping. It is the shaping happening continuously without a separate moment of achievement at the end. He came asking what must be done to find the teaching. Zhao Zhou's answer is not a technique. It is a redirection. He is not sending the monk away to wash more carefully and return in 10 years. He is collapsing the distance the monk assumed existed between himself and the teaching. There is no gap to cross. There never was a gap. Wash your bowl. The bowl is here. The hands are here. The water is here. Start there. For someone listening at the end of a hard day, tired, behind on things, feeling far from anything like peace, this teaching arrives at an unexpected angle. There is a quiet despair many people carry around practice. The belief that they are too tired, too busy, too scattered to do this properly. That what is being pointed at requires conditions they do not have right now. The practice feels like somewhere they will be able to go once life settles down. Zhao Zhou's exchange cuts through that belief directly. The monk did not arrive enlightened. He arrived ordinary, having just eaten his morning meal. Zhao Zhou met him exactly there, with a bowl, warm water. The next ordinary action. The teaching is not, go and be more mindful while you wash. The teaching is, the washing already contains everything. The separation between where you are now and where the teaching lives, that separation is the one thing this entire sitting has been quietly dismantling. It was never real. Another day, a student came to Zhao Zhou and asked what the Buddha was. Zhao Zhou pointed to the statue in the hall. The student said, "Surely not that painted wood." Zhao Zhou said, "Yes, that one." The student expected something elevated. a description of original nature, a teaching worthy of the enormity of the question. Zhao Zhou kept pointing at what was already in the room. The sacred was genuinely there, and the student was looking straight past it. This is a teaching about where the sacred actually lives. The stone in the courtyard, the bowl in the kitchen, the sound of water. These are not metaphors pointing towards some deeper truth behind them. They are the truth present without any elaboration required. Dogen wrote in the Genja Koan, "To carry yourself forward to witness the 10,000 things is delusion. To allow the 10,000 things to come forward and witness themselves is awakening. The bowl does not need you to bring Zen to it. The bowl is already complete. The washing is already complete. The moment of hands in water is already complete." The mind built around seeking finds this disorienting. It is organized around the project of getting somewhere. Give it a destination and it knows how to work. Remove the destination. Show it that what it was seeking was always the ground it was standing on, and it reaches for the familiar restlessness again. "Surely there is more to it," it says. "Surely the sacred is not this close." Zhao Zhou's entire teaching life was a quiet, persistent redirection of that reaching. He was showing them that what they were seeking had never been absent. The seeking itself was what placed it at a distance. Come to rest in the ordinary moment, in the bowl, in the hands, in the next simple task, and the distance collapses on its own. Zhao Zhou lived to be very old. The records note this without explanation or celebration. He was not practicing longevity. He was simply and completely present in each moment he inhabited. Each bowl washed. Each question received and answered, usually in a single phrase. Each ordinary morning entered fully. He was not managing his experience from a step back. He was in it. He was not accumulating towards something. He was already there. He was always already there. And the teaching he gave the monk at the gate was the same invitation. You are already there. Begin from there. This is both the simplest and the most unsettling thing the practice can offer. Simple because nothing needs to be acquired. No prerequisites. The bowl in front of you is the gate. Unsettling because the seeking mind does not know what to do without a project. It has been running toward a horizon its entire life. Tell it the horizon was always here, and it may, for a moment, simply start running in a different direction. That is fine. The bowl will still be there when the running quiets. What changes, slowly, the way water changes stone, is the quality of ordinary moments. Standing at the sink, hands in warm water, the small friction of cloth against clay. Already complete. Already the whole thing. This moment, exactly as it is, without anything added. The monk who travelled far found what he was seeking in the kitchen. Before any formal instruction, in the response to what was already present. 3 words. The most direct instruction in the history of Zen. Zhao Zhou did not explain. He pointed. There is a word in Buddhism for what was present in that courtyard. For what is present in the bowl, in this breath, in the listening happening right now. Dogen spent years circling this word, reading the old sutras, finding in them something no one before him had quite said aloud. The teachers called it Busho, and what Dogen found in that teaching changed how the entire tradition understood what practice was for. There were 2 monks in the same monastery in central China. One was the head monk, senior, learned, respected by everyone in the community. His name was Sheng Xu. The other was a kitchen worker who had arrived 6 months earlier. He ground rice. He chopped wood. He had never formally studied the sutras. His name was Huineng. The 5th patriarch of Chan Buddhism had announced that he would pass his robe and bowl, the transmission of the teaching, to whoever could demonstrate true understanding of the Dharma. Students were invited to write a verse on the monastery wall. Sheng Xu wrote his verse at night, alone, on the corridor wall. The body is a Bodhi tree. The mind is like a bright mirror's stand. Polish it constantly, constantly. Don't let any dust alight. Everyone who saw the verse was moved by it. The 5th patriarch acknowledged it publicly. He told the monks to recite it. But in private, he said something different. The verse shows understanding. It does not show the essential nature. Huineng had the verse read to him. He was illiterate. He stood listening. Then he asked someone to write his own verse on the same wall. Bodhi originally has no tree. The bright mirror also has no stand. Originally, there is not a single thing. Where could any dust alight? The 5th patriarch read it. He wiped it off the wall immediately, so as not to attract attention. Then he summoned Huineng that night and gave him the transmission. Huineng became the 6th patriarch. Both verses are pointing at the same thing from different distances. Sheng Xu's verse is true. The mind can be clouded. Attention can be trained. The practice of polishing is real and valuable. But Huineng's verse goes further. There is no mirror stand because the mirror is not a thing you maintain. The bright nature of the mind is not a property that was installed and can be removed. It is the original condition. Dust lands on the surface of daily experience. The noise, the distraction, the habit of resistance. But the dust is not the mirror. The mirror was never contaminated by what settled on it. Wipe the surface, and what is revealed was there before the wiping began. This teaching moved through the entire Chan tradition and eventually reached Japan as Zen. Centuries later, a Japanese monk named Dogen would read it again and go even further. Dogen was working through the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, one of the foundational texts of Mahayana Buddhism. The sutra contains a line that every practitioner of his era knew by heart. All sentient beings have Buddha nature. It was taught as a statement of hope. All beings, without exception, carry within them the potential for awakening. No one is excluded. The poorest monk, the most confused mind, the most scattered heart, all have the seed. All can reach it. Dogen read the sentence again. And he found something the teachers before him had passed over. The standard reading said, "All beings have Buddha nature." Have, like owning a quality. Something you would need to find, or uncover, or earn through years of practice. Dogen read the same words and heard something plainer. All existence is Buddha nature. Being and Buddha nature are not two things, one containing the other. They are the same thing, seen from the same place. What you are looking for is what is looking. This changes everything. If Buddha nature is something you have, then practice is the path to claiming it. You begin without it fully accessible. You work. You arrive. If Buddha nature is something you are, if it is the very fact of existence itself, then practice is not a path toward it. Practice is its expression. The sitting, the washing of the bowl, the water arriving at the stone. These are not steps toward Buddha nature. They are Buddha nature, visible. Dogen wrote this in the Shobogenzo, the treasury of the true Dharma Eye, in a chapter he titled with the single word, Busho. The implications he drew from his reading were precise. Practice does not create Buddha nature. Nothing you do generates it. Nothing you fail to do diminishes it. What practice does, what the years of sitting, the koan, the bowl, the water are all doing, is clear away the layers of habit and resistance that have accumulated on the surface, making it difficult to recognize what was always present underneath. Think of the image Dogen returned to most often. The moon reflected in water. On a still night, the reflection is clear, sharp and luminous on the dark surface. A stone is thrown. Rings spread outward. The reflection breaks apart, multiplies, fragments into scattered light. The moon appears to shatter. but the moon is undisturbed. The waves change the reflection. They did not touch the moon. When the water calms, the reflection reassembles, not because anything new arrived, but because the disturbance cleared. The moon was there the entire time. The waves in the mind, the noise, the running thoughts, the years of accumulated resistance do not damage Buddha nature. They disturb the recognition of it. They make the surface difficult to read. But what they are disturbing is not the thing itself. They are disturbing the surface of the water. The moon remains. This is what the practice is clearing. Not producing light. Removing what makes the light hard to see. The distinction matters because it changes what failure looks like. A practice aimed at producing something can fail to produce it. The years of sitting have passed, and the awakening has not arrived, and the practitioner concludes that the method was wrong or they were inadequate. A practice aimed at clearing has a different relationship to difficulty. The difficult sitting is not a failure. The restless hour on the cushion is clearing. The distracted morning is clearing. Even the period of abandoning practice and returning, that arc is clearing. What is being removed is not just the noise of a single session. It is the accumulated pressure of a lifetime of believing that what you are is not enough as it is. Bankei Yoktaku, the 17th century Japanese teacher whose own crisis opened the teaching on the unborn, said it in the plainest terms he could find. He would speak to large crowds of monks, merchants, farmers, servants, people who had never studied sutras and never intended to. He told them, "The mind you are using right now to hear these words, that mind is Buddha nature. It does not need to be created. It cannot be lost. You arrived with it. You will leave with it. The only question is whether you recognize it." People would ask him, "But what about my anger? My jealousy? The thoughts that keep arriving even when sitting, the restlessness, the distraction. If Buddha nature is here, why do these things persist?" Bankei would answer, "When your neighbor speaks to you in anger, you hear the anger. But you also know it is anger. The knowing of it, the awareness that recognizes anger as anger, that awareness was never angry. The wave is not the water. The storm is not the sky. The wave is real. The storm is real. But neither the wave nor the storm is the totality of what you are. There is something in the mind that witnesses what arises without being consumed by it. The thought arrives. Something knows it arrived. The knowing is not the thought. The knowing is older than the thought. Steadier. It was here before this particular wave and will be here when it passes. This is Busho as a lived experience rather than a concept. Now consider this for someone who is carrying pain. Real grief that has not lifted illness. The exhaustion of a life that has demanded too much for too long. The loneliness that arrives at night and stays until morning comes, but the feeling does not go with it. Busho does not mean this pain is not real. The wave is real. The stone thrown into the water is real. The broken reflection is real. No teaching in any tradition worth trusting will tell a person in genuine pain that the pain is an illusion. What Dogen is pointing at is something else. He is pointing at the one who knows the pain, the awareness that recognizes the grief that has been present with the illness, that has witnessed the long nights and the long years. That awareness is not broken. It has not been diminished by what it witnessed. It held the pain the way water holds the stone, surrounding it, carrying it, not consumed by it. The pain is real. The one who knows the pain is larger than the pain. This does not end suffering. It changes the relationship to suffering. The difference between drowning in the wave and being in the water when the wave passes through. Both are wet. The experience is not the same. The old teachers were careful about this distinction. They did not say, realize Buddha nature and suffering will disappear. They said, realize that what you are is not only the suffering. The suffering is a wave. You are the water. And the moon above the water, which the wave cannot touch. This has a practical consequence that every practitioner who has sat long enough eventually notices. The sitting does not eliminate difficult thoughts. It does not produce a state in which uncomfortable feelings no longer arise. What changes, slowly, through years of meeting what arises with open hands rather than clenched ones, is the ground beneath the arising. The sense of who is here expands. The thought is still the thought. The one receiving it has become larger than the thought. The wave is still the wave. The water has stopped mistaking itself for a wave. Dogen said this about practice and realization with complete directness. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the 10,000 things. The sequence he describes is a loosening. The grip on the constructed self, the one who is trying to become, trying to achieve, trying to get somewhere, relaxes. And in that relaxing, what was always present becomes recognizable. Not new. Recognized. The mirror. Huineng's verse was not saying the mirror does not exist. It was saying the mirror's fundamental nature, the brightness that makes reflection possible, was never in danger. What you have been maintaining with such care was always clean. The dust was only ever on the surface. And the surface is not the mirror. Practice removes the dust. It does not install the brightness. The brightness is what was there before the dust arrived, before the first habit of resistance, before the first learned fear, before the first story about who you are and what you deserve. All of that is on the surface. None of it is the mirror. Bankei called this the unborn. The quality of mind that was present before it learned to be troubled. Before it acquired the patterns it now works so hard to manage. The mind as it was, the moment it arrived, open, clear, without the weight of accumulated reaction. He was not saying go back to being an infant. He was saying recognize what has always been underneath the accumulation. The unborn is not behind you in time. It is here now, operating underneath everything else. The awareness itself, the knowing, the thing that is receiving the experience right now, without effort, without special training, because it has never stopped being what it is. There is a moment in long practice, and people describe it differently, and it arrives at different points for different practitioners, when something settles that has never fully settled before. It is not dramatic. There is no sudden light. No arrival of a state that was not there before. It is more like a recognition, the way you recognize a face you have always known but suddenly understand you knew. The awareness that was always here becomes legible. The searching stops. The destination was always here. The searching was the only thing placing it at a distance. The Zen teachers described this recognition with care because it is easy to misunderstand in two directions. One misunderstanding is thinking the recognition is permanent, that once seen, it stays visible. It does not always. The waves return. The dust settles again. The practice continues. Continuity is the nature of water. It keeps arriving. Each return to the stillness is itself the practice, as complete as the first. The other misunderstanding is thinking the recognition must be dramatic, that you will know when it happens because everything will change. This is also not reliable. Zhao washed his bowl. The monk stood still in the courtyard. Dogen sat in Rujing's hall in the winter of 1225 and heard, drop body and mind. These were ordinary moments in which something clicked into place. Nothing arrived that was not already present. Something that was already present was finally seen. This is what the entire journey of this sitting has been pointing toward. The mind that runs, pointed at from the very first teaching, was not the problem to be solved. It was the surface of the water in disturbance. The thought that felt like truth was the wave appearing to shatter the moon. The sitting that led nowhere was the water becoming still. The water arriving at the stone without force was recognition that the stone was never the real obstacle. The bowl was the gate. And underneath all of it, underneath the disturbance and the practice and the recognition and the forgetting, something has been here without interruption. Steady, unborn, undamaged by whatever has passed through it. the mirror. Busho is not a reward waiting at the end of practice. It is not reserved for those who have sat long enough, or suffered enough, or understood enough. It is the ground of the practice, the water in which everything moves, the sky in which the storm appears. What changes with practice is not the presence of Busho. That does not change. What changes is the frequency with which it is recognized. The length of time the water stays clear after the stone is thrown. The ease with which the surface returns to stillness. And in this moment, this breath, right now, it is here. The listening is happening. The awareness receiving these words is present. It did not need to be built. It did not need to be earned. It has been here through the whole sitting, through every teaching, through every moment of distraction and return. The distraction did not touch it. The returning did not create it. It is what Zhaozhou's bowl was pointing at. What Dogen found in the winter of 1225 when his teacher spoke and something dropped away. What Bankei discovered at the edge of death when a phrase arrived about a bird calling clearly in the morning. The unborn is here. Right here. The same awareness that has been receiving every word of this sitting, the attention that arrived in the first moment and has not left, that is the thing being pointed at. Not after the noise ends. Here, inside the noise, holding the noise, undisturbed by the noise. There is a tree. It does not chase the wind. The wind arrives, moves through the leaves, passes. The tree is not more a tree when the wind is absent. It is simply more visible. The tree does not need the stillness to be what it is. The stillness only makes it easier to see. This is the quality available right now. In this breath,